Title: Nurse underestimates Black woman's labor pain, unaware her husband runs the hospital. Hey, welcome to the channel where we dive into stories that shake you to your core. Today's tale. It's a roller coaster of emotions, a real eye-opener on racial bias in healthcare. Grab some tissues because this one's gonna hit close to home. The hospital room was bathed in a cool, sterile light, the hum of machinery a constant reminder of where Lena was and what she was about to do. She inhaled deeply, clutching the armrests of the chair. In the corner of the room, a mixture of excitement and anxiety coursed through her body, a cocktail of emotions that had defined the last few months of her life. The moment she dreamed about was finally here. "How are you feeling, babe?" Mark's voice broke her thoughts. He was standing at the window, tall and composed, but his eyes gave away the nervous energy just beneath the surface. He was dressed in his usual business attire, a crisp white shirt with a navy tie loosened around his neck. But today, he wasn't the hospital COO, he was just her husband, soon-to-be father, and the man who had been her rock through the highs and lows of pregnancy. "I'm okay," Lena replied, smiling softly at him, but her hands betrayed her calm exterior, resting protectively over her swollen belly. "I just want to get this little one out of me," Lena said, which made Mark laugh as he walked over to sit beside her. He took her hand, rubbing slow, reassuring circles on her palm. "We've got this," he said. For a moment, Lena allowed herself to lean into the comfort of his words, the sense of unity and love that had carried them through their journey. They had dreamed of this child for years, through fertility treatments and late-night prayers. Now, their baby girl was so close to being born. The anticipation weighed on her, but in the best way possible. As another wave of pressure rolled through her abdomen, Lena's expression shifted slightly. She breathed through it, focusing on the rhythm of her inhale and exhale. "Just another contraction," she said almost to herself, as if she were reminding her body to stay calm. Mark watched her carefully, his eyes scanning her face for any sign of discomfort. He squeezed her hand, leaning in. "You sure you're okay?" Lena nodded. "Yeah, just ready. I feel like this pregnancy has lasted forever." Mark smirked. "You've been saying that since month 6. They shared a light laugh, but beneath their easy banter, there was an unspoken understanding that the real challenge was just beginning. This was labor, no amount of preparation or excitement could fully predict how it would go. Earlier that morning, when her contractions had begun to regulate, Lena had instinctively known it was time. The slow, rhythmic tightening in her belly, which had once been sporadic, became steady, almost like a countdown. The doctor had told her this could happen any day now, and after a quick call to the hospital, they'd packed up and driven in, their hearts racing in time with the tires against the road. Upon their arrival, the maternity wing had been calm. Nurses greeted them with practiced smiles, showing them to their private room. Despite the friendliness, Lena couldn't shake the odd sense of vulnerability that came with being a patient, even in a hospital her husband practically ran. She sat back in the bed, adjusting herself as Mark paced beside her, looking every bit the anxious father-to-be. "I thought I'd be calmer than this," he admitted, running a hand over his neatly trimmed beard. "I've overseen operations in this place, but this is different. It's because this time it's personal." Lena offered a smile, her hand resting on her belly, feeling the familiar kick of their daughter. "We've waited for this moment for so long, and now it's here." Mark bent down, kissing her forehead gently. "You're the strongest woman I know. You're going to do great." A soft knock on the door interrupted their moment. In walked a woman in her late 40s, her blonde hair tucked into a neat bun, her expression one of cool professionalism. She wore a standard-issue nurse's uniform, crisp pressed scrubs with a name tag that read, Karen. Her pale blue eyes swept the room before settling on Lena. "Good morning," Karen said, her voice pleasant but detached, like someone who had done this hundreds of times before. "I'm your nurse for today. How are we feeling?" Lena shifted slightly in the bed, already feeling the beginning of another contraction. "I'm okay, just starting to feel the contractions getting stronger," she replied, keeping her voice steady. Karen nodded, barely looking at Lena as she scribbled something on the clipboard in her hands. "That's normal. First-time moms often think the pain is worse than it is, but don't worry, we'll get you through it." Mark, still seated beside Lena, watched the nurse carefully. Something about her tone felt dismissive, but he said nothing, not wanting to make assumptions. Lena, however, couldn't help the small knot of unease that began to form in her chest. She had heard stories, many stories of women, especially black women, who weren't listened to during labor, who had their pain dismissed or minimized. But that wouldn't happen here, not in Mark's hospital. Another contraction hit, stronger this time, and Lena winced, gripping the sheets. Karen glanced up from her clipboard, her eyebrows raised slightly but said nothing. Lena forced herself to breathe through it, but the dull ache in her lower back was intensifying. "I think I might need to lie down," she said, her voice straining. Karen clicked her pen and walked over, adjusting the bed's position without much comment. "It's too early for the epidural, but we'll monitor your progress." An epidural is a type of pain relief given during labor that numbs the lower part of the body, making it easier to manage the pain, she explained. "Let me know if anything changes," and with that, Karen left the room, her demeanor professional but distant. Lena lay back, staring at the ceiling. The contractions were coming faster now, and despite her best efforts to remain calm, she felt a growing unease in the pit of her stomach. She wanted to trust the nurses, the doctors, but something about the way Karen had spoken to her ate at her. Mark, noticing the change in Lena's expression, squeezed her hand again. "Everything okay? Do you want me to call the nurse back?" Lena shook her head, forcing a smile. "I'm fine. It's just nerves." Mark, obviously having no idea what was going through her mind, nodded, though there was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. "We're in good hands, Lena. Just focus on breathing." Lena tried to do just that, focus on her breath, on the life growing inside of her, on the joy that was supposed to be coming. But beneath the surface, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She pushed it down, telling herself that she was just being paranoid. But as another contraction hit, harder and more intense than the last, the knot in her chest tightened. As time passed, Lena's initial contractions continued to ramp up. She shifted uncomfortably on the bed again, trying to find a position that offered some relief, but the pain was intensifying faster than she had anticipated. Each wave of discomfort was more aggressive than the last, wrapping around her belly and lower back like a vice, squeezing tighter and tighter. Mark was still by her side, holding her hand, though he could sense the growing tension in the room. His reassuring words had reduced, replaced by a steady stream of concerned glances toward the door where Nurse Karen had disappeared after her last check-in. Lena breathed in deeply through her nose, exhaling slowly as the next contraction hit her like a freight train. This time, she couldn't suppress the gasp that escaped her lips. Mark immediately leaned in closer. "Are you sure you're okay?" "You don't look okay, babe." Lena shook her head, beads of sweat forming on her brow. "It's worse than I expected, much worse." Her voice trembled, not just from the pain but from the creeping fear that something wasn't right. Mark stood up, a look of determination on his face. "I'm getting the nurse." Lena watched as he strode to the door, poking his head out into the hallway. A few moments later, Karen re-entered the room, clipboard in hand, her expression the same distant professionalism as before. "Is everything okay?" Karen asked, her tone lacking any real warmth or concern. "My wife's in a lot of pain," Mark said, his voice strained with worry. "She says it's getting much worse. Can we do something for her? Maybe check how far along she is?" Karen gave a slight nod, but there was an edge to her voice when she responded. "It's normal for labor to get more intense as it progresses. She's only been here a short while. First-time mothers often think the pain is worse than it really is." Lena clenched her jaw. She had been in pain before, real pain. This wasn't something she was overreacting to, this was different. She swallowed her frustration, trying to stay calm, "But could you at least check?" Mark insisted, his voice firmer now. "Just to be sure." Karen sighed, setting down her clipboard and snapping on a pair of gloves. "Fine, let's take a look." She performed the exam quickly, her face giving nothing away as she checked Lena's dilation. After a moment, she stepped back, stripping off her gloves with an air of finality. "You're only about 3 centimeters dilated," Karen said, her tone clipped. "You've still got a long way to go. This could take hours. We'll check again in a couple of hours, but right now, there's not much we can do except wait. The pain is just part of the process." Lena's heart sank at the nurse's words. Hours? How was she supposed to handle hours of this if it was already this bad? She could feel the tightness in her chest return, the knot of fear and frustration growing larger with each contraction. I don't think I can wait that long, Lena said, her voice barely a whisper. Something doesn't feel right. This isn't normal. Karen raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. Every labor is different. You're doing fine. Just try to relax. How was she supposed to relax when her body felt like it was being torn apart from the inside? Mark, sensing Lena's distress, spoke up again. Is there anything we can do to help with the pain? Maybe some medication to take the edge off. Karen shook her head, barely hiding her impatience. It's too early for an epidural, and we don't want to slow down labor with unnecessary interventions. Let's give it some more time. Lena felt a lump form in her throat. She glanced at Mark, seeing the worry etched across his face. This wasn't just normal labor pain, she could feel it deep in her bones. Something was wrong, but no one seemed to be listening. As the minutes ticked by, the pain grew worse, almost unbearable. Lena gritted her teeth, her hands gripping the sides of the bed as another contraction tore through her body. Her breathing became shallow, her skin damp with sweat. Mark's voice cut through the haze of pain. Lena, talk to me. What's going on? You look like you're in serious pain. I am, Lena managed to gasp out between contractions. It feels different, so sharp, like something's tearing. Mark's face paled. He had never seen Lena like this, and his own fear was starting to creep in. He glanced toward the door where Karen had disappeared once again. This isn't right, he muttered. I'm getting the doctor. Without waiting for a response, Mark marched out into the hallway. Lena could hear him speaking to someone in the distance, his voice tight with frustration. Karen returned a few moments later, her expression extremely annoyed. We just spoke about this. I told you it's too early for anything serious. I understand you're uncomfortable, but this is normal. Lena could barely register the nurse's words. The pain was consuming her now, pulling her under like a wave she couldn't escape. She tried to speak, to tell Karen that this wasn't normal, but her voice was drowned out by the sheer intensity of the contraction. Mark came back into the room, his face grim. He stood beside Lena, his hands trembling slightly as he took hers in his. The doctor's in surgery right now, he said softly. They said he'll be here as soon as possible. Lena nodded weakly, but her mind was racing. What if the doctor didn't make it in time? What if something terrible happened to her or the baby because no one was listening? Time became a blur after that. Lena's contractions were now relentless, each one crashing over her like a tidal wave. Her vision blurred with tears as she clung to Mark's hand, her body trembling from the pain. Every time she tried to speak, the words were swallowed by the intensity of it all. Mark hovered by her side, helpless, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced toward the door again, his jaw clenched. I don't care what she says, he muttered. Something's not right. I'm getting the doctor from the operating room. Before he could leave, another nurse entered the room, her expression more attentive than Karen's had been. She checked Lena's monitors, her brow furrowing slightly as she glanced at the readings. "I'm going to call for backup," the new nurse said, her voice calm but firm. "Just hang in there, okay? We're going to take care of you." For the first time in what felt like hours, Lena felt a flicker of hope. Someone was finally paying attention. But before the new nurse could leave the room, Karen reappeared, a scowl etched across her face. "What's going on?" Karen demanded. "I've got this under control." The new nurse hesitated, glancing at the monitors again. "Her vitals are dropping. We need to act fast." Karen crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "I've been with this patient since she arrived. She's fine. We don't need to overreact just because she's uncomfortable." Mark's anger finally boiled over. "Uncomfortable," he said, his voice shaking with fury. "My wife is in serious pain, and you've been brushing her off this entire time. If you don't get someone in here right now, I'm going to have your job." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but the new nurse was already reaching for the phone. "I'm calling the doctor," she said firmly. "We're not taking any chances." As the nurse dialed, Karen shot Mark an angry look before storming out of the room. Lena barely noticed, she was too focused on the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, on the growing sense of dread that something terrible was about to happen. She felt like her body was slipping away from her, no longer under her control. The contractions weren't just painful, they were brutal, each one ripping through her with a ferocity that made it hard to breathe, let alone think. Her vision blurred at the edges, and she could feel the cool sweat beading on her skin. "Lena." Mark's voice was a low hum in the background, but the words were lost to her now. It was just the pain, relentless and overwhelming, a force that was too big for her to fight. "Lena, I know. I'm getting help," Mark said, his face pale and etched with worry as he leaned closer. She felt her hand go slack in his, her fingers cold and trembling. A fresh wave of panic coursed through her. She couldn't pass out, couldn't lose control. She had to stay conscious for herself, for the baby. But her body felt like it was shutting down, piece by piece, and no one seemed to be doing anything to stop it. The new nurse, the one who had sensed something was off, moved with urgency now. She was adjusting the monitors, her eyes flicking to the numbers and readings with increasing concern. Her blood pressures dropping, the nurse muttered, half to herself, half to Mark. "We need the doctor now." Mark was on his feet, pacing, his face a mask of helpless fury. "Where the hell is he?" he snapped, his voice shaking. "She's getting worse." Lena groaned, her hand instinctively flying to her belly as another vicious contraction hit. But this one was different. It wasn't just pain, it was sharper, more urgent, and there was a heaviness that pulled at her lower abdomen. Her heart pounded in her ears as a terrifying thought took root: the baby. Something's happening to the baby. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her vision began to narrow, tunneling into darkness. And just as she felt herself slipping under, the door burst open. Dr. Parker strode into the room, his face set with professional determination. He was still wearing his surgical cap as though he had rushed from the operating room. Without a word, he took in the scene, the pale monitors, the panic in Mark's face, the desperate look in Lena's eyes. Immediately, he sprang into action, moving to Lena's side and checking her vitals. "We need to stabilize her," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Get the OR prepped for an emergency C-section." Mark stepped forward, his hands balled into fists at his sides. "What's happening to her? What's wrong?" Dr. Parker looked up briefly, meeting Mark's eyes. "She's in distress. The baby's in distress. We don't have time to waste. She needs surgery now." Mark's breath hitched in his throat, but before he could respond, Karen re-entered the room, her face twisted with frustration. "I don't think this is necessary," she said, her voice tight. "She's only been here a few hours. This is her first baby. These things take time." Lena, her head swimming with pain and fear, barely registered Karen's voice, but Mark's reaction was immediate. He whirled around to face her, his expression filled with an intensity she had never seen before. "Are you serious right now?" Mark's voice was low, trembling with restrained fury. "My wife is lying here on the verge of collapse, and you're still dismissing her pain. She's not an inconvenience, she's a person, a mother, and you're ignoring her." Karen flinched at the accusation but squared her shoulders, holding her ground. "I'm just following standard procedure. She's not progressing fast enough for surgery." Dr. Parker straightened, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Karen. "You should leave this room now." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but Dr. Parker cut her off, his voice colder than before. "I said leave. You put this patient's life in jeopardy by failing to act when she needed help. If you stay, you'll make things worse. Get out." Mark stood silent, his jaw clenched tight, watching as Karen, her face flushed with embarrassment and anger, stormed out of the room. Dr. Parker turned back to Lena, who was now barely conscious, her breathing shallow and rapid. "We're taking her to the OR now," he said. "Prep the team. We don't have a second to spare." Lena felt herself being lifted onto a gurney, the cool air rushing over her as they wheeled her out of the room and down the hall. The overhead lights blurred as they moved faster and faster, and she could hear Mark's footsteps echoing close behind. "Stay with me, babe," Mark's voice called from beside her. He was holding her hand as they sped down the hallway. "You're going to be okay. The baby's going to be okay." Lena tried to squeeze his hand, but she didn't know if her fingers responded. She was so tired, so unbearably tired, and the pain was now a distant throb, muted by the haze that had descended over her body. But the fear was still there, sharp and all-consuming. She wasn't just afraid for herself anymore, she was afraid for the baby. What if they were too late? What if all this time she had been right, and no one had listened until it was too late? As they burst through the doors of the operating room, the sterile smell of antiseptic hit her, and the bright lights overhead made her squint. The medical team was already assembled, moving with quick precision to prepare her for surgery. Dr. Parker leaned over her, his voice calm and reassuring despite the chaos around them. "Lena, I'm going to take care of you. We're going to deliver your baby right now, okay? Just hang on a little longer." Lena nodded weakly, unable to speak but grateful for the presence of someone who finally seemed to be taking her seriously. As the surgical team prepared to start the emergency C-section, Mark was forced to step back, watching helplessly as his wife was wheeled behind the blue curtain. He stood just outside the operating room, pacing, his hands running through his hair as his mind raced. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had spent years managing this hospital, ensuring that patients were cared for, that every detail ran smoothly. But now, with Lena's life hanging in the balance, he felt utterly powerless. A nurse approached him, offering a sympathetic smile. "They're doing everything they can," she said softly. "Dr. Parker is one of the best.